Winner-Take-All Politics by Jacob S. Hacker and Paul Pierson is an eye-opening look at how American politics and policy changes since the 1970s have fueled the concentration of wealth at the very top, while the vast majority of Americans have lost ground. Drawing on extensive research and sharp analysis, Hacker and Pierson argue that rising inequality is not simply the result of impersonal economic forces like globalization and technological change, but rather the product of deliberate political decisions that have shifted power and resources to the rich and super-rich. The book makes the case that the hyperconcentration of income gains in the hands of the top 1% and top 0.1% is the defining feature of the modern U.S. economy, enabled by a sustained political assault that has undermined institutions and policies that once protected the middle class. Hacker and Pierson contend this was not an inevitable outcome driven by unstoppable market forces, but a political choice resulting from the successful mobilization of business interests and wealthy elites and the demobilization of the middle class. Through compelling evidence and powerful examples, winner-take-all politics charts the rise of this winner-take-all economy over the past generation, the failure of government to respond, and the immense stakes for restoring broadly shared prosperity. It is ultimately a clarion call to reclaim American democracy from the clutches of concentrated economic power and extreme income inequality. Hacker and Pierson begin by documenting, through painstaking analysis of tax and income data, the momentous rise in inequality that has occurred in the U.S. since the late 1970s. Upending conventional wisdom, they show the real economic divide is between the broad majority of Americans and the tiny sliver at the pinnacle of the income ladder. Drawing on groundbreaking work by economists Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez using IRS tax data, they reveal that from 1979 to 2005, the richest 1% of households gained over one-third of all income growth. The top 0.1%, 1 in 1,000 households, gained over one-fifth of all income growth, more than the bottom 60% combined. These trends have only accelerated. From 2002 to 2007, the top 1% captured over one-half of total income gains. Meanwhile, for the vast majority of Americans, the past generation has been a time of stagnating incomes, rising economic insecurity, and declining economic mobility. Wages for the bottom 90% have barely budged, despite substantial economic growth, while the costs of housing, healthcare, and education have soared. The economic standing of the broad middle class is actually more precarious than it was a generation ago. But the gains of economic growth haven't simply been unevenly distributed. They have flowed overwhelmingly to those at the very peak of the economic pyramid. Hacker and Pierson vividly illustrate the hyperconcentration at the top through eye-popping statistics. In 2005, the average income of the top 0.1% was $7.1 million, more than quadruple what it was in 1974, adjusted for inflation. In that same period, their share of national income more than quadrupled from 2.7% to 12.3%. Those at the tippy top, the top 0.01% or 15,000 richest households, saw their average income skyrocket to $35 million by 2007. These trends cannot be explained by a widening gap between college-educated workers and those with only high school degrees, the common theory known as skill-biased technological change. The explosive growth in inequality has occurred almost entirely within highly educated groups, between the top 10% and the top 1%, and even the top 1% and top 0.1%. A typical college graduate has seen only modest gains compared to the astronomical rise enjoyed by the economy's big winners. Importantly, Hacker and Pierson show the winner-take-all economy is a uniquely American phenomenon. Other advanced economies exposed to the same forces of globalization and technology have not seen inequality skyrocket to nearly the same degree. No other rich nation has experienced such an intense concentration of income gains at the absolute peak of the latter. This points to a deeper truth. Rising inequality is not an inevitable consequence of abstract economic trends, but the result of policy choices shaped by the exercise of political power. The rise of extreme inequality and the failure to ensure broad-based prosperity is ultimately a political story. Having established the contours of the winner-take-all economy, Hacker and Pierson turn to uncovering its political roots. Contrary to claims that government policy is merely a sideshow in the face of powerful economic headwinds, they argue, government has played a central role in amplifying inequality over the past generation. The most obvious way government has fueled the winner-take-all economy is through tax policy. Since the late 1970s, taxes on the highest earners have been dramatically cut, even as their pre-tax incomes have exploded. Comparing effective tax rates in 1970 and 2004, the top 0.01% saw their average tax rate fall from 74% to 34%. The top 0.1% saw their rate nearly cut in half from 69% to 35%. The top 1% saw their rate fall by one-third from 47% to 31%. This represents an enormous shift of resources to the best-off Americans. If the merely rich and super-rich today face the same tax rates they did in 1970, Hacker and Pierson calculate a very big chunk of the growing distance between the super-rich and everyone else would disappear. These tax cuts were the result of repeated political choices, not abstract economic forces. Starting in the late 70s, both Republicans and Democrats began competing to shower tax cuts on those at the top through reductions in top marginal rates, estate taxes, and taxes on capital gains and dividends. From Reagan's supply-side cuts to Bush's tax breaks for the wealthy, political leaders made taxing the rich more lightly a consistent priority. But the tax burden on the wealthy has fallen through more subtle means as well. Cuts to IRS enforcement have made it easier for high-income earners to game the system and shelter income. Many business owners and hedge fund managers have been able to exploit loopholes to pay taxes at lower rates than their secretaries. All told, changes in tax policy account for a major share of the rise in after-tax inequality. Government's role in shaping the winner-take-all economy goes well beyond taxes, however. More fundamentally, government makes the market and determines how its rewards get distributed. As Hacker and Pierson put it, there are no pre-political markets. Markets are inevitably shaped by political forces. Over the past generation, political choices have again and again tilted markets to favor affluent groups and business interests. A prime example is the collapse of American labor unions. Unionization in the private sector plummeted from over 30% in the 1950s to under 10% today. This occurred not because of abstract economic trends or workers' choices, but deliberate employer attacks enabled by a political climate increasingly hostile to unions. In the late 1970s, labor tried to strengthen protections for organizing through reforms to the National Labor Relations Act, but these efforts were blocked by an all-out mobilization of business. Hacker and Pierson describe it as the most vicious, unfair attack upon the labor movement in more than 30 years. As government abandoned its traditional role mediating between labor and capital, employers were unleashed to deploy ever more aggressive union-busting tactics with little restraint. As union power waned, so did a key bulwark defending the economic interests of the middle class. Without a strong, organized counterweight, Corporations and wealthy individuals have been able to tilt the playing field in their favor and claim an ever greater share of the economy's rewards. Middle and working class Americans have lost crucial leverage in both the workplace and the political arena. Another way government has shaped the winner-take-all economy is by enabling the meteoric rise of executive pay. CEO compensation has skyrocketed not because of executives' rising value, but because government has allowed managers to essentially set their own pay through captured corporate boards. In 1965, the typical CEO made 24 times the average worker's earnings. By 2007, it was over 300 times. This is a result of political choices, not economic necessity. In the early 1990s, reformers sought to rein in executive compensation by forcing companies to report stock options issued to CEOs as an expense. But business groups and their allies in Congress blocked the change, allowing lavish pay packages to flourish without scrutiny. Other efforts to empower shareholders to check executive pay have similarly been thwarted. In the words of a veteran shareholder activist, the worst instincts of the CEO community have triumphed. Perhaps most fatefully, political decisions have freed the financial sector to engage in the risky practices that generated huge rewards for a select few while ultimately crashing the economy. Over the past 30 years, government has steadily demolished the system of regulations put in place during the New Deal to curb financial speculation and fraud. This was not a natural response to changing economic conditions, but the result of a concerted push by Wall Street to roll back constraints on its activity. As a top Clinton Treasury official later acknowledged, the consensus to let financial markets drive the economy was enormous, and there were no strong voices on the other side. Deregulation became a self-reinforcing process, as increased competition among financial institutions created pressure to take ever greater risks in pursuit of profits, risks that would be laid at the feet of taxpayers when crisis struck. At every step, government was anything but a bystander to these developments. Again and again, politicians ratified the demands of financial interests through deregulatory actions that destabilized the economy and encouraged the destructive practices fueling the surge to the top. In 1999, Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act separating investment and commercial banking, a move that paved the way for the creation of massive financial supermarkets like Citigroup. In 2000, Congress blocked efforts by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to regulate financial derivatives, the complex instruments Warren Buffett famously called financial weapons of mass destruction. From 1990 to 2000, the revolving door between Washington and Wall Street spun ever faster, with financial firms' hiring of federal officials and regulators increasing fivefold. As a result, oversight of the industry withered even as it grew larger, and its practices grew riskier. In economist Simon Johnson's words, "The benefits of economic growth when growth returns will be concentrated at the top because policy has been driven mostly by special interests." Having shown how government has shaped the winner-take-all economy, Hacker and Pierson turned to explaining the political roots of this transformation. How could American democracy, founded on principles of political equality, so consistently advance the interests of an affluent minority at the expense of the broad middle class? The authors locate the answer in the erosion of what they call middle-class democracy, the mass membership organizations and participatory institutions that once gave ordinary Americans a voice in politics and policy. Over the past generation, these organizations have withered while those representing wealthy interests have flourished, shifting the balance of power toward the top. The paradigmatic example is the ongoing decline of organized labor. At their peak in the mid-20th century, unions represented over one-third of private sector workers. They were a powerful countervailing force to the cloud of business, fighting for broadly shared prosperity both in the workplace and in politics. As Hacker and Pierson write, labor's role was not limited to wages and benefits. Unions offered an organizational counterweight to the political power of the affluent. But as union membership has fallen to less than 7% of private sector workers today, so has this check on concentrated wealth diminished. Without a strong, organized base pushing for the concerns of working Americans, policy has predictably tilted toward elite priorities. Even Democrats, labor's traditional allies, have been cross-pressured to be more solicitous of business as unions have lost both members and political muscle. The withering of unions is part of a broader decay of traditional mass membership groups that once engaged middle-class Americans in politics. Organizations like the American Legion, fraternal societies, and religious federations have seen their numbers plummet in recent decades. As civic participation has waned, so has the voice of ordinary citizens in the halls of power. Meanwhile, the resources and clout of business groups have grown substantially. As economic power has become more concentrated, corporate interests have invested heavily in political organizations to shape policy in their favor. From the Business Roundtable to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the National Federation of Independent Business, an armada of business lobbies has mobilized to roll back regulations, slash taxes, and block reforms. The imbalance is striking. Hacker and Pierson note that the Chamber of Commerce alone spent $65 million on lobbying in 2008, while the AFL-CIO, the nation's largest labor federation, spent $4 million. On many economic issues, business groups are now virtually the only organized interest represented in policy debates. Other affluent interests have adapted to the new environment as well. In the 1970s, a new generation of professional advocacy groups burst onto the scene, giving voice to upper-middle-class priorities like environmentalism and women's rights. While valuable, these groups focused on post-material causes with limited appeal to working-class Americans struggling to get by. This shift from mass membership organizations to professional advocates has produced a participatory tilt in American politics. The most active and influential groups increasingly reflect the concerns of an educated, higher-income minority, not the broad economic worries of the middle class. Combined with the decline of labor and other blue-collar federations, it has left ordinary Americans without an organized base to make their voices heard. Politics has simultaneously grown more dependent on money, especially as the price of campaigns has soared. Both parties now devote enormous energy to courting wealthy donors whose views are far to the right of the general public on economic issues. For Democrats in particular, reliance on affluent contributors has created stark tensions between their traditional identity as the party of the working class and their need to maintain the allegiance of the rich. All these trends have made the terrain of American politics more favorable to the demands of powerful economic interests. With strong organizations to represent them and weak opposition from the disorganized middle, the richest Americans have been able to tilt policy in their favor and reap the lion's share of economic gains. In a system where money talks, they now have the only real voice. Having diagnosed the political roots of the winner-take-all economy, Hacker and Pierson close with a call to action. Restoring broad-based prosperity, they argue, will require more than modest policy tinkering. It demands a renewal of American democracy to rebalance power between the affluent and the rest. Here, the authors return to history for inspiration. In the first Gilded Age of the early 20th century, reformers challenged the dominance of monopoly capitalism through a decades-long struggle to expand the scope of democratic government. Despite stiff resistance from economic elites, Their efforts curbed the power of organized wealth and laid the groundwork for a period of middle-class prosperity after World War II. Today, we are in a second Gilded Age, defined by the outsized power of a new plutocracy. The top 1% have successfully mobilized to skew the economy and government in their favor, resulting in a self-reinforcing cycle of concentrated wealth and political influence. Countering this will require an equally sustained project of political renewal and mobilization. Ultimately, Hacker and Pierson argue, restoring middle-class democracy will require a sustained effort from citizens themselves. Elites have no interest in relinquishing their grip on government power and instituting reforms that would dilute their influence. The only force strong enough to dislodge the entrenched defenders of the status quo is an aroused public, organized and determined to hold political leaders accountable.